There used to be a house behind a fence in the quiet farmland between Norborne and Carrollton, Missouri. The fields were long and empty, and the rail tracks were thin. It wasn't fancy, just 2 stories of whitewashed brick with a narrow chimney, a weathered cross above the door, and an orchard that was set up so perfectly it looked like it had been practiced. People in the area used to call it the Harvest House for Lost Girls. However, nobody ever said what the harvest was, between 1884 and its quiet closing in. In 1901, this farmhouse was used as a faith-based reform home for girls who had been labeled as disobedient, immoral, or not good enough for public school. That's what the county says. But recently found ledgers, sterilization forms, and a discovery buried under a strawberry patch that was going bad. Tell a much darker story about eugenics that was okay with the government, forced labor, and sedation experiments. And what you're about to hear is true. It's history with the names crossed out. This is what takes place when morality turns into a business, and young women are used as data points in someone else's idea of what is pure. Welcome if you're new here. We tell stories that everyone else tried to hide in a quiet, honest, and non-sensational way. Sign up if that's something you care about. Leave a comment to let us know where you are listening from. These places may seem far away, but they were built in the middle of America. Let's go back to 1884 spring. After a harsh winter, Missouri was in full bloom. There were newspapers in every church. The Harvest House was given its first official placement after Sheriff Samuel Dyer signed off on it. Case number Z1, Lillian May, 15 years old. Continued wrongdoing and refusal to read from the Bible. The girl did not have any living parents. She had been caught dancing without shoes on one occasion behind the Methodist Church. That was enough. The Harvest House was started by the Women's Society of Rural Morality, a Christian charity that got money from the state, and later by the Missouri Eugenic Health Trust. You won't find this group in books. The house was run by a woman named Eunice Bell Shepherd, who used to be a midwife and was now a reformer. She was stern but caring, and she only wore gray and talked about pulling sin out by its roots. She wasn't the only one. There was a doctor on staff who didn't have a license, a German chemist hired to balance temperament through tonic correction, and 2 single sisters, Martha and Agatha, who were in charge of keeping moral order and moral observation. They all lived in the house. The gates were closed to everyone else. The public thought the Harvest House was a good idea. Church bulletins praised the girls' quiet dignity as they went home to be proper and job-ready. Pictures showed young women reading psalms in neat rows, shelling peas, and weaving baskets. But they didn't show the cuts that were hidden by high collars, the sudden illnesses, or the long stretches of silence. In 2008, a construction crew that was cleaning up the back orchard found a sewing box that was rusty. In there are 8 bundles of linen that was sewn by hand with red thread. Each bundle had names, drawings, pages, and thought fragments. One entry was written over and over, but it wasn't signed. They called us weeds. Later, botanists confirmed that the soil had unusually high amounts of alkaloids that make you sleepy and mercury nitrate. Soil that wasn't meant to grow anything but to forget. How did a home for reformers become a farm for sterilizing people? How did journals get buried under strawberry plants? And why did the state keep paying for it for almost 2 decades after multiple deaths were reported as a failure to fix the problem? To find out, we'll have to look through bills, inventories, court orders, censored letters, and the file of one girl who tried to record everything before her voice was taken. Her name was never written down, but she left something behind that the orchard couldn't break down. A piece of stitched linen buried in the ground near a dead tree root. 5 words were written on it. Do not plant what screams. An act was passed by the Missouri Assembly in 1883. The Moral Correction Appropriations Act is the name of the bill. It gave state money to organizations that taught girls ages 9 to 18 who were in moral danger how to do things around the house and in the garden. On paper, it was an attempt to deal with poverty-related crime and what was seen as the decline of womanhood in an America that was quickly becoming industrialized. But there was a way out in the bill's language. It wasn't clear what moral endangerment meant. That meant that any girl could be put in a home, which is where the Rural Morality Society came in. Henrietta Alums, a railroad widow and devout Methodist from St. Charles, started the society in 1879. It started out as a temperance auxiliary that handed out pamphlets against bad behavior in cities, but in just 3 years, it had grown into what one ledger that was still around called the moral repatriation of fallen femininity. Henrietta wasn't by herself. The society's board was made up of the wife of a Supreme Court judge, the daughter of a doctor with ties to Washington University, and 2 sisters of a Baptist bishop. They were all dedicated to the growth of future leaders, structured humility with their wives. They weren't mean, at least not in the way that most people think of mean. They thought they were protecting girls and society as a whole. They thought that disobeying orders could spread, that sexual abuse could be used with work, and that women who refused to give in were genetic threats to society. There was more to this than religion. Early eugenics in the United States, dressed up in a petticoat and corset. By 1884, the society had all the money it needed to build the Harvest House as a test site for something that was quietly called a correctional seeding farm in letters. Letters found in a locked cabinet in 1993 say that the house was meant to be a proof of concept. Could disobedience be bred out of beautiful women? Could sterilization be okay if it was done by a religious leader? Could society get rid of future problems by making girls pure now? To the public, the society kept holding tea fundraisers, putting out Bible verses, and pushing the idea that good things come before punishment. They did it behind closed doors, were buying sedatives, iron restraints, and tinctures with mercury in them. One bill from April 1886 just says, 8 doses, cognitive dulling solution for girls unfit to marry for orchard work rotation. The house matron, Eunice Shepherd, sent updates to the board every month. Some of her reports were kept. One says, 2 girls bled after taking the tonic. One was taken away, and the other is now quiet. Her posture has gotten a lot better. During hymn recitation, we tried the new compound on another girl. The doctor was happy with how slowly things were going and thinks that they will be stable within a week. Mrs. Hester Crane suggested a way for families to feel better. Instead of sending the girl back, a box would be mailed with something comforting, like a ribbon, a cross-stitched verse, or a hair clipping. By 1890, over 160 girls had gone through the Harvest House, but only 43 were officially discharged. The others were marked, reassigned, sent back to care, or were no longer viable. No graves or headstones were recorded, but the strawberry rows were still there. Also, the fields behind the barn were always surprisingly full, especially after the first frost. One more thing. In 1891, a delivery man named Clinton Morse wrote in his ledger that he wouldn't carry another crate of hymnals because they were too heavy for books. Sounds of sloshing. It smelled like salty and sweet things. It was rose water, they told me. He died in a veterans hospital in 1926. When his trunk was opened, they found a cross-stitched piece of fabric inside. She came to Norborne in the spring of 1884 with a leather satchel, a medical journal, and a book of psalms with notes in red ink. Her name was Eunice Bell Shepherd, and she was 48 years old. She had never been married and had been a midwife in Jefferson City. She had no formal theological training, but the society praised her as a housekeeper. The girls at the harvest house called her matron. Her philosophy, which was never published but was later found in pieces, was sewn into housekeeping. She taught during orientation hymns and called it the doctrine of good soil, a metaphor she said she got in a dream. She said the girls were like seeds that got planted in bad soil. The world had let them down with parent city's temptations, and their spirits grew crooked and fruitless. But with pruning silence and a better container, they could bloom again. But some soil, she said, could not be made clean. This is her own words from an undated letter. The Lord gives soil of two kinds, red and gray. The girls were put into groups based on how easily they could be manipulated. The girls in the gray group were resistant, defiant, self-harming, and morally sterile, so they were burned and buried. The girls in the red group were young, responsive, and scared, making them perfect for domestic futures. The girls in the pale group were unhappy, disobedient, and smart, needing to be sedated and locked up. The girls in the gray group were never seen outside after their first week. Eunice put in place a plan she called the triune cleansing. 3 stages. Silence rotation, where they were locked up alone for 72 hours and could only talk when scriptures were read or tonics were given. Labor correction, where they did the same tasks over and over again in the orchard, often barefoot, while being watched by sisters from the dorm. And refinement night, a final cleansing ritual held in the chapel, after which the girls' behavior was reevaluated. There are no pictures of refinement night, but girls who lived say that only 2 ever spoke near the end of their lives. A reclining chair, closed eyes, and a machine with a crank that hummed like an organ dying. One girl, who was 12 years old at the time and was sent to a mental hospital for inappropriate touching and laughing without reason, was later whispered to have said, "She made us kneel with sugar on our tongues. If we swallowed before the bell rang, we got the rope bath." Another girl talked about the blue light and the masks that dripped honey. Most people could no longer tell the difference between a memory and a dream. The Historical Society damaged a few boxes of institutional records, but one sealed envelope was saved. Inside was a page called Soil Evaluation Report, Spring Intake, 1893. There was a category and a column for each girl's name, with the words viability status, domestic, workhouse, or non-viable next to each one. Next to Edna Jo K. 13, it said gray. It meant no return. There was silence. There was no burial. There was no discharge. There was no more mention. That spring, the orchard grew. 4 new trees were planted near the northern fence, and the ground was smooth. After many years, a short-lived effort to preserve history found a rosary that was burned halfway through, and a piece of cotton with 7 red X's stitched into it. 1 cross for each non-return. She was never put on trial. She died in her bed in 1908, her lungs full of fluid and her lips stained with tonic. No one claimed her body, but her last written sentence is still tucked into the margin of her Psalms book next to verse 3. It says, "Some gifts must be buried to be sanctified." His name was Dr. Hehart Clean, and he came from Cincinnati using a fake name. His credentials, which were never checked, said he studied neurochemical balance and female disorders in Munich before the Franco-Estonian War, but immigration records show no such training. He did have a history of quietly moving between clinics, with claims of over-sedation and missing patient charts following each one. He was hired, but his claims were never backed up. In late 1885, the Society of Rural Morality hired him as the formulary supervisor for the harvest house. His job seemed simple: make chemicals that help with moral stillness, encourage quiet reflection, and lower episodes of emotional unrest. But what he made was something completely different. In 2007, labels from broken glass bottles were found behind the barn. They read, "Tonic B, night obedience serum 4C, domestic temperament adjustment, morning dew solution, speech delay variant. After some time, tests showed that the mixtures contained chlorohydrate opium tinctures and mercuric chloride, a corrosive compound that was already known to cause neurological damage, hallucinations, and long-term memory loss. These weren't mistakes, they were eraser tools. The tonics were given to the girls every day as part of their recovery plan. Some took spoonfuls during chapel, while others put drops on their tongues while they slept. One report found in a crate of mislabeled farm equipment ledgers describes the tonic reduces verbal resistance as desired. Within 36 hours of the first dose, Category Gray girls become inert. Most of them don't make eye contact or talk. One went into a state of devotional repetition, reciting Psalm 38 for 4 days straight without stopping. Some girls reacted violently. They vomited blood from their gums or convulsed. These girls were marked for orchard reassignment, which is now thought to mean burial under fruit rows. Klein came up with a way to control dosing. Many girls started refusing the sugar cubes because they thought it was a reward, while others thought it was a sign of mercy. In response, Klein wrote a proposal that is now in the Missouri State Archives. It says, "If sugar is seen as mercy, we must teach them it is obedience." Food will help you remember the lesson. One piece of linen found in the 2008 orchard excavation, with letters that are stitched together in tight, shaky lines, says, "Those who fast shall forget." The sweet ones sleep first, is the only thing we have from the inside to call it. They forget to close their eyes. Their prayers get mixed up. Nobody ever got a letter from Dr. Klein. He lived in a shed next to the greenhouse and rarely went to chapel, but he left very detailed, cold, and coded records. He ranked girls by compliance slope, a term he borrowed from agricultural grafting in a notebook that is still around. The subject with the highest score was Jay, who is 11 years old and completely flattened by day 5. Jay won't talk and only eats when told to, blinks in time with the metronome. A good starting point for the next batch. A circle drawn in faded pencil in the margin. Tonic 4 C plus music equals best. The staff later called that mix of chemical sedation and playing the same piano note over and over again the lullaby protocol. There is evidence that Klein tried out different kinds of arsenic microdoses, animal tranquilizers, and extra additives. In the cellar, rabbits were used to test one chemical. None of them lived longer than 4 days, but girls were not given such. Pick. In the final inventory log from the fall of 1893, Klein ordered 72 glass vials to be used for spreading fruit in the orchard. Along the northern fence, 4 new strawberry beds were dug the same week. Klein was last seen in 1894. There was no resignation letter or forwarding address. There was only a signed receipt for a train ticket to Kansas City and a note written in German that was left in his ledger drawer. It means, they don't scream anymore. Only the earth remembers their sound. It's simple to believe they all did it. They said that the girls at Harvest House were too broken, too high, or too young to fight back. But that's not entirely true. Some of them did try to escape, but their names were never written down in official discharge records. Their absence was felt in other ways, like in disciplinary memos that were missing linen counts and entries that said, "Subject absconded." The orchard perimeter was secured, and tonic redistribution increased. Between 1886 and 1895, 12 escape attempts were recorded across internal. Most of the cases ended the same way. The girl came back dirty and feverish, sometimes silent and sometimes screaming. She was then reassigned to reflection quarters, which is a code word you should already know. But 3 girls just disappeared. There were no records, reassignments, or recovery entries. Instead, there were sudden rises in sedative orders the week after, as if their disappearance didn't need an investigation but a stronger silence. The most famous case among staff was simply called. That's not why she was called the Window Girl. She was called that because she left behind a window that never stopped crying. On the second floor of Dormitory D, there is a single glass pane that fogs over from the inside no matter the weather. In a picture taken in 1913, when the building was being cleaned up to be sold again, the photographer saw a handprint on the inner sill. The fingers were too small for their own good, and there was a trail of blood along the sill's edge. That picture was labeled South-Facing Room Unclaimed, and an old, torn-up ledger entry says that the girl who slept in that bed was 14 years old, and her name was Marble J. She was committed for refusing to name the father after an unmarried pregnancy claim that was never proven. She came in pale and thin, and one intake form says she was red in the eyes. Marble stayed for 6 weeks, and on her last night, a staff report just says, Hymn number 47 disrupted. Dorm 2B was woken up and a window. However, that's not the end of her story. In 2009, while digging for an independent research grant under Harvest House's foundations, a wooden crate was found under the crawl space of the old laundry wing. Inside was a hairbrush with the initials MJ burned into the handle, a strip of muslin cloth with hand-drawn map symbols stitched in red, a hollowed-out Bible with 10 pages taken out, and a copper coin. Nobody should eat the candy. There was a broken small glass bottle and a dried sprig of white clover tied with strawberry twine. Whoever Marble was, she didn't just run away. She left a trail, and someone followed it. Because 3 weeks later, Rosalie W. 12, another girl, was found trying to crawl under the tool shed. Her mouth was sewn shut badly, like she was scared, so she couldn't talk when asked. She only pointed to the orchard and said, in her stomach, the doctor found strange fibers and resin fragments. The last note said that the suspect had tried to swallow a muslin scroll. The orchard was turned 3 days later. There was no press or autopsy. But years later, under the boards of the chapel stage, a hymnal was found with its binding split and 5 red stitches sewn through Psalm 34. Only one verse was underlined in pencil. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in heart. That page had been carefully folded 4 times into the shape of a star with blood on one edge. They weren't nurses or clergy. They didn't wear uniforms or carry tools, and they never spoke in chapel, but every girl at Harvest House knew who they were. Martha and Agatha House, who were only known as the sisters, came in 1886 after a fire destroyed the orphanage they had run in Quincy, Illinois. The fire was officially called accidental, but a court memo filed afterward quietly dismissed. However, the Society of Rural Morality didn't see a problem with it. They praised the sisters for their years of dedicated service and unwavering morals. Within months, they were put in charge of discipline at Harvest House, reporting directly to matron Ununuk Shepherd. They were never photographed. The only picture that is known of them is a damaged tint type that shows 2 women in gray dresses standing behind a wire fence, one hand on the shoulder of a child. Sat between them, her face hidden. The sisters' rules were never written down, but they didn't need to be. They were built into their posture, their silence, and the bruises that faded under their shawls and sleeves. An internal memo found in a ledger called Dormitory Protocol, Autumn Rotation 1889, said that they used a system of 3 signals: 1 knock, silence, 2 knocks, and 3 knocks. If you didn't follow them, you disappeared. Behind the pantry, there was a narrow door painted white. The door was the same color as the wall and had only a pinhole slot. Girls called it the Hollow. One note that was written into the corner of a hymnal said that inside was a bench that was too short to lie down on and too narrow to stand on. The hollow was never officially recognized, but in 1998, workers fixing the building found it still whole, with a broken spoon, a piece of cloth with 6 tally marks, and a piece of wool blanket with the word "still" stitched in pink. There was no light and no electricity. The only opening was a small one at the ankle level, which could be for passing food or not. The sisters had strict routines. One punishment schedule found in Agatha's personal Bible, which was later found in a used bookstore in Nebraska, said that punishments were to be done in groups of 3s, 3 hours of kneeling, 3 days of fasting, and singing 3 hymns over and over again for each offense. Below that, in smaller print, it said, "Do not let them sleep until the verse is silent in their throats." The sisters slept in a small alcove above. In the main dorm, their beds were nailed to the wall, and each had a wooden box under the frame with the year written on it. Most of the boxes were empty, but one dated 1892 had 17 hair ribbons, a set of baby teeth, and a tag that said "Girlings." No one knows what that word means, but it shows up several times in the journal that the girls stitched and buried under the orchard. Last week, Ruth turned girling. Agatha smiled when the girling didn't cry. Martha says, "Grings don't get graves, they get planted." By 1894, even other staff started to stay away. In his last tonic log, Dr. Klein wrote, "The sisters ask for less lighting in Dorm B. People say that in the dark, pupils get bigger faster. I refuse." The next spring, he was nowhere to be found. There is only one record of Martha and Agatha left, which is a letter that was put in the wrong donor box at church. It was never sent by mail. The writing is stiff and looks like it was clawed. "They sleepwalk now. We don't knock. They move before we do. Last night the one with red hands stood." It says, "We burned Agatha's things in the orchard pit, and she won't open her eyes. The roots are full, and they're no longer afraid of us." The sisters were taken away quietly in 1896. There was no reason given, and no one was charged. The society said they'd gone to spiritual solitude, but in 1922, an elderly woman at the Missouri State Infirmary named M.H. was found writing names on the walls of her room. When asked what they meant, she said, "They were mine. I carried their mouths on my back." The staff found a hymn book under her mattress. The words to "Be Still My Soul" had been scratched out, and it was written in its place, "Be still their voice, be still their fight, be still the ones who know the night." Her name was never written down in the intake ledgers. There was no medical history, no birth date, and no mention of her in chapel rolls or tonic logs. But the people who came after her and found her book buried under the oldest mulberry tree would call her the seamstress. We think she was deaf from birth, but from being hurt. There is a small note scratched into the bottom of a wash basin that says, "Tongue went still after hollow." She had quick fingers, that much is clear, because she started sewing around the end of 1892. Not clothes or linens, but secrets. She made a covered journal out of stolen muslin pieces, frayed pillowcase corners, and even torn hymn pages. Each page is about the size of a palm. She used strawberry twine to tie them together, and red thread for almost all of the marks. Thick, crooked lines. There are planned patterns and sometimes whole words spelled in needlepoint. In 2007, 32 fabric pages were found inside a child's backpack, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked next to the bodies of people who had been buried under a mulberry stump. The items were not like anything that had been seen in any other known institutional archive. Some entries looked like vague clumps of red thread that looked like roots or spider webs. Some of them had clear shapes, a person on their knees in front of a gray wall with a cut in it, a spoon with an X stitched into it, the face and eyes of a woman, blocked by red bars. There are 9 stitched windows and one of them is torn open. There is a full sentence on the 14th page. The nice ones go to sleep first. The Grings don't come back. What scared me the most was the last page. One word was sewn under the whole thing. It was a rough map of the orchard with 7 red knots, each with a number on it. Still, a forensic analysis proved that most of the pages were sewn together with cotton thread. 3 of the entries, though, had different protein-based fibers that were later found to be fine human hair. And dark. Some people think it was hers. There are no records of the girl being lost or buried, but archaeologists found a set of child-sized bones under the same mulberry tree. The right hand was missing 3 fingers. There was a needle stuck in the rib cage that was one of the bones. When the satchel was found, it got the attention of historical groups, researchers, and even the children and grandchildren of former staff. Some people said it was a fake. Others said the sewing was too planned, too full of meaning, fear, and pain, not to be real at all. Then, in 2012, something happened that put an end to all doubt. A woman, who was fixing up the floorboards in her attic in a rural farmhouse 50 miles from Harvest House, found a second fabric journal that was almost the same. The strawberry twine is the same size. There are 7 new pages inside, and one of them has a stitch note straight to the person. They won't be able to find me if you do. They don't like red. They bury red. And in the bottom corner, the window girl M.J. Marbell is stitched in a thin line. That is, the seamstress did more than just record. She helped other people remember things. It was because of her that the girls could speak out even when no one else would. The mulberry orchard behind Harvest House looked like any other row of twisted trees at first glance. The fruit on the trees had stained the ground a dark, almost purple-black color. There was always something different about the ground under those trees, though. It was softer and more flexible. Even after the facility closed in 1902, workers said they saw strange substance zones near the far end of the apple tree. There was no digging. In a letter home, one groundskeeper said, "It's like the earth won't settle, like something underneath keeps breathing." It's not official. The trees in the orchard were left to grow too big and choke each other out until 2007. An outside group of researchers who were originally hired to record forgotten institutional sites across Missouri were given rare access to the overgrown grounds. They found something that wasn't in any state records or on any official maps. 12 trees and 12 holes. Each one was under a fruiting mulberry, but the ground around them was empty. The trees produced fruit when it wasn't supposed to. Some branches had grown in perfect spirals, like someone had twisted them without being seen. The team started digging slowly, and what they found under the ground would become one of the most upsetting finds of an institutional grave in Midwest history. There are 7 shallow graves with no markers or coffins. Each grave had the bodies of children, some as young as 10 years old. Grave 1, the body of a girl aged 11 to 13. She had a metal spoon pressed into her jaw and her hands were wrapped in muslin. Grave 2, at the shoulders, 2 sets of bones joined together. One skull showed signs of being hit hard. 25. A rusty metal tag that says grieving number 12. Grave 7 bones spread out in a random way. The torn pieces of red thread fabric that were used in the seamstress's needlebook were close by. There were no death records for any of the bodies. There are no death records. There is no cause of death given. After, the state stopped the dig in a quiet way. The 7th grave because they were worried about unstable soil and contamination. But pictures of small rib cages still curled up in defense positions with red thread wrapped around the phalanges like rings had already been leaked. Someone who used to work as a state archivist and asked to remain anonymous said there are at least 20 more graves. They didn't care about it. But that wasn't the end. The researchers found an artifact among the bones that shocked them. A folded piece of muslin that is stitched in red. It had a door, a tree, a spoon, and Below it was a single word that was stitched on very roughly. The last page of the seamstress's book is the same red thread. In other words, the burials weren't just kept secret. They were a ritual. Something was set up in a certain way. It wasn't for shade or fruit that the mulberry trees were planted. The plants were put there to grow over the dead, eat them, and shut them up. They failed, though, because the girls left something behind. There was red thread, maps, names, stitches, and truths that wouldn't go away. They were known as the Society for Morality in the Country. A group of judges, ministers, and agricultural reformers started the Society in 1879. They said it would protect the moral fiber of the American heartland. On paper, its mission was to help orphaned girls, correct bad behavior in young people, and restore the morale of vulnerable groups. It turned out to be something much colder. Harvest House wasn't their first project, but it was the one that did the best. Land grants paid for by private donors and quiet support from Methodist and Baptist. Churches, the Society set up a model for hidden prison care that was far from cities and out of sight of authorities. They didn't call them prisoners. These people were known as wards of redemption. From 1884 to 1901, records show that the Society had 14 admissions councils. Each one looked at girls for moral weakness, seduction, impurity, or criminal softness. Few of the girls were charged. They only had bad names. One internal memo says, "Too smart, too curious, reads forbidden material. Not allowed in. Unmarried, pregnant." As a daughter of a black man and an Irish mother, she was admitted without being reviewed. The Society had a secret committee called Section 5. Their job wasn't to help people get better. It was to check for genetic weakness, mental instability, unpredictability in reproduction, and criminality, all based on behavior and appearance. Section 5 worked with traveling doctors from Boston, Philadelphia, and later St. Louis who brought early versions of what we now call. They used Harvest House as a testing ground, marking girls who didn't follow the rules, were too imaginative, or weren't fit for housework as Type R refractory in internal reports. These girls were marked for sedation tonic dosing and, in 31 cases, sterilization. Families were never told about these procedures, and many of the girls never came back home. There is a scary quote in a ledger marked SRM Archive 5 Supplemental Weight 93. "The soil of a nation must be tilled with virtue. We prune." Most of the founders of the Society went on to have successful careers as senators, bishops, and editors. Harvest House was quietly shut down in 1902. There was no scandal or trial. It just faded away like chalk in the rain. But its legacy lived on in whispers passed down through families buried in attics sewn into cloth. Then, in 2015, something amazing happened. A descendant of one of the founding Society members gave a trunk to a Missouri Historical Society. Inside the archive was a bunch of letters written by members of Section 5 to each other about how well their rural placements went. One line stood out. Of the 94 girls who were processed, 11 showed persistence in memory and symbolic resistance. The red stitchers must be watched. They embed truth, they knew. They feared the red thread because it carried what they couldn't erase. Truth sewn by trembling hands outlasted paper sermons and sermons. It wasn't just defiance, it was. The fire started just after midnight on October 3, 1901, and people in the nearby town of Dellwood said they saw orange light over the ridge followed by thick plumes of black smoke. By dawn, the whole building had collapsed, leaving only charred orchard stumps and a half-melted metal bell from the main hall. Few weeks later, the incident was described as an uncontrolled structural combustion initiated in multiple ignition points. This means it wasn't an accident, but there were no arrests, investigations, or charges. There was only silence, as if someone thought that being quiet was safer than telling the truth. The Society for Rural Morality made a short statement about the tragic loss of a facility that did its moral job well. They didn't rebuild, and they didn't come back. But not everything was destroyed. In 1973, a group of folks in the area who were looking for grave markers from before the Civil War found the remains of a basement wall still standing where the chapel used to be. Words scratched into the brick with a rusty spoon read, "They took our names. We took the fire." A second message with less clear writing said, "She lit it." Someone who sewn. The seamstress or one of her students is thought to have set the fire. The reasoning was cruel and clear. If the world wouldn't come to save them, they would bury thee. One person who survived the fire was taken in by a traveling Quaker family the next day. A journal entry from that family said the girl wouldn't talk and carried a bag with 3 red X's sewn on it. She had burn scars on her arms and cried every time she smelled mulberries. In 2006, a rusted hinge and a soot-blackened ring of keys were found near the southeast edge of the orchard. There was also a small porcelain spoon that had not been damaged by the fire. We lived, we burned, and we still are. Was the fire revenge, a last act of defiance, or a funeral pie for truth? The world refused to see. Or maybe it was all three, and still, the ground smells faintly of fruit and smoke when the wind blows in a certain way over the old orchard. It snowed early that year, and Delwood was quiet in the winter, just another forgotten dot in Missouri's rolling countryside. But on December 14th, 1968, a stranger came. She was old, wore gloves sewn together with red thread, didn't give her name, paid in cash, and walked with a limp. That night, she rented a room at the Whitest Stone Inn and asked for directions to the old orchard. The innkeeper who remembered her years later said she had a look that made it seem like she knew exactly what was buried and exactly what wasn't. Before dawn the next day, she walked alone to the site of Harvest House. The orchard had gone wild, with overgrowth suffocating the roots and frost covering the ground. Moving carefully, she stopped at the base of the third tree, knelt down in the snow, and started to dig with her bare hands. What she buried there would not be found again until 1992. A child's satchel wrapped in wax cloth, a metal spoon with the initials MJ faintly etched on the handle, a small muslin square stitched with 4 red windows, one marked with an X, and a letter sealed with wax addressed only to those who will listen. The letter was written in tight spidery script and read. Part of the sentence says, "We burned it, not to forget, but to stop them from taking more. The orchard grew from us, and it is still there. It was already taken, but I remember her name. The woman who taught me how to sew was never seen again. They will say we were broken, but broken things can still bloom. You only have to look beneath the roots," the woman said. One thing was left in her room, but everything else was left alone. The mirror was facing the wall now. A picture of Harvest House's sewing dormitory from 1901 was found in a university archive many years later. A girl, with a crooked left shoulder and a satchel with 3 red X's, stood in the far back corner, partly hidden by shadow. The records never named her, but her thread ran through all the stories and her fire through all the truths. Now it was her steps that broke the silence. It took years to figure out. People used to think that the stitched pages were symbolic or for looks, revealed an entire story system. A spoon, a window, a tree, and a flame were all symbols of different events. Names, rooms, and punishments. The girls had memorized a whole language while being told they had to be quiet. The Red Thread Journal, the work of linguists and forensic historians at the University of Missouri, went public in 2021. They called it a narrative of memory and resistance to systemic abuse that had been sewn together. Without words, this is one of the most complete first-hand accounts ever recorded. Each symbol was linked to a body, an artifact, or a survivor's story. Every grave, locked door, and name that wasn't there matched. What used to be local legend was now proven history. Harvest House was not a moral institution that failed. Fear-based money was used to run a machine of fear and silence that was hidden by religion. When the results came out, the state said they were sorry, but they didn't offer any compensation. The churches involved didn't say anything. The children and grandchildren of the Society for Rural. Morality stopped people from knowing or being responsible. The stitched pages were shown in a small gallery in St. Louis, one long wall, thread by thread, loop by loop, with the title, "We Spoke in Thread." It didn't matter what else was going on. People came and cried, kids stared, and old women, some of whom had been silent for decades, started to talk. The red lines were now being traced by a new generation of girls who were not scared but rather knew what they meant. And right next to the last page, embroidered with a flame and A small plaque on the spoon said, "We weren't lost, we were taken. But we left the door open, a door that can never be closed again. Not by fire, not by silence, not by those who tried to forget, because someone remembered and someone stitched."